We now have our third-party library in place and a PHP mailer object ready to go. We had to cover quite a bit of ground to get here, but now we're finally ready to send the email. Open up contact.php. When we have a form submission, we receive all the variables from the post array, we validate all the data, and then we create a PHP mailer object. After that, it's time to send the email. We left this to-do comment here about sending the email, and we can now replace that comment with the rest of the code from the example. Let's walk through the rest of the code line by line. These two lines deal with defining the body of the email. The example loads it from an HTML file. We already have the body of the email in a variable named email body, so we can remove these. This line calls a method in our mail object. When this PHP mailer object sends an email to us, the email can have one or more reply to names and addresses. This method adds a new reply to name and address to the email. We'll want to be able to reply to the person who filled out the form, so let's set this to their name and address. The next line of code calls another method. When the object sends us an email, that email will have exactly one name and address in the from field. Calling this method will set that. The email will be coming to us from the person who filled out the form, so let's set the from name and address to the value submitted to the form. Now that I think about it, we don't really need a reply to email address. By default, email clients will reply to the from address, which will work just fine for us. We can remove this call to the add reply to method. There's another call to add a second reply to address here, which we can also remove. This next line of code calls another method that looks like it adds the name and address of a recipient. In our case, the email should go to Mike. I can use static values here instead of variables because these values won't change from form submission to form submission. When this PHP mailer object sends out an email, it will have a subject. This line of code here references one of the object's properties related to that. Method names, like function names, always have parentheses after them for the argument list. Properties, on the other hand, are more like variables. You assign them a value with a single equal sign, just like a variable. Let's concatenate the person's name to the subject line. This can be helpful with email clients that group messages together into conversations. If all our form submissions have the same subject, they may all get grouped together into one conversation, which could be confusing. This next line assigns a value to another property. It looks like it might be alternate content for email clients that can't read HTML. There's a comment out here that says it's optional, so let's go ahead and remove that. Mike will be the only recipient of this email, and his client does support HTML. This line calls another method that sets the body of the email. We have the body of the email in a variable named email body, so let's set that now. Since we'll be sending an HTML email, we actually do need HTML tags for the hard returns in the email body, instead of the PHP escape characters. I'll fix that at the end. These two lines call a method for adding attachments to the email. Our email doesn't need any attachments, so we can remove that. The object is all set up and we're ready to send the email. This last block of code from the example does that by calling the object send method. But it might look a little strange to you because it calls the method name within a conditional. If you call a function or a method in the check of a conditional, PHP will first execute the function, and then it will use the return value from the function as part of its check. Let me walk you through a simpler example. This line of code creates an array with two elements. This conditional has a function call to the count function within it. PHP calls the count function, gets a return value, in this case that value is 2, and then uses that return value in the conditional, checking to see if it's less than 31. Let's now look at the code from the PHP mailer example. PHP calls the send method, which should send the email using all the properties we set up earlier. The send method returns a value of true or false, true if it's sent and false if it didn't send. We can write a conditional that checks the return value like this. If it worked, if the email was sent successfully, then the code in this conditional will execute. We can also put the negation operator in front of this method call to change our conditional to check if it did not work, if the email was not sent successfully. The rest of the code from this example displays different messages depending on whether or not the email was sent. Let's integrate this conditional into our flow. If there's an error, we should display an error message and stop our code from executing. This code here displays the particular error message. It accesses one of the object's properties. Notice the name of the object followed by the 2 characters that make a single arrow. The word error info does not have parentheses after it, so it refers to a property instead of a method. If there is an error, we want to stop the page from processing. This block of code executes if the send message did not work successfully. If it did work successfully, though, there's nothing else we need to do. We kind of assumed it was going to work successfully already. We can remove the else block here. If the email was sent successfully, we can redirect to the thank you page. The last thing we need to do here is modify the email body so that it uses HTML tags. Since it's an HTML email, we'll need HTML break tags for the hard returns. I recommend using a third-party library for sending the email, which we now have in place, but I also recommend using a separate mail server. The code as we have it written right now uses the web server itself to send the email. This code probably won't work on your local server, but there's a pretty good chance that it will work on your production server. You'll have to deploy it and test it to find out for sure. We'll do that next. Even if it works though, it's still a much better practice to use a separate mail server. I wrote a blog post about doing this with PHP Mailer, using a service like Postmark or Gmail over SMTP as your mail server. Email providers take spam very seriously, and your server could get flagged as a spam server if your site or another site on your server gets compromised. If that were to happen, your form submission emails might get blocked, or they might skip your inbox and go to a spam folder. It takes a little extra effort to set it up, but using a separate mail server is definitely the right way to go. That's what I'll be doing for Mike's T-shirt store.